Attention, attention. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first of our We Have Ways of Making You Chalk specials. A title that it took James and I 18 entire British months to come up with.
And I never came up with it, actually, to be fair. You did.
And you didn't come up with it. It's your history festival, and you didn't come. You had to rely on some two-bit stand-up to think of it for you. Anyway, aside from that, so what we're doing this week is to mark the
festival as it should have been.
Festival as it could have been and as it can be now in this COVID version. Our lockdown Chalke Valley History Festival. And so what we're going to do is every day we're going to talk to someone, and the Second World War may well come up, as our regular listeners know, but we're going to afford ourselves some tangents here because of the people we've managed to muster from James's list of historians who were stood down. Historians at home twiddling their thumbs, and we are delighted to kick this series off with a legend of history broadcasting and of history itself, Michael Wood. Thanks so much for joining us.
It's a great pleasure. I'm missing Chalke Valley already.
Oh, you and me the same, Mike. And I just want to listen, Mike. I'm going to make you. I don't want to kind of make you blush or anything, but you know, you are one of the reasons I am a historian, because. In my formative years, I was, as a teenager, sort of getting excited and interested in history. There you were, gadding about Troy and Dark Ages Britain, and I was absolutely hooked by those TV series. I thought they were just completely wonderful, and I just thought, God, wouldn't it be fun to do that? That would just be like my perfect job. And lo and behold, later on in life, we end up making stuff together, and I end up making programs for your company, Maya Vision, and we've become pals, and it's just been great. I mean, what a joy!
Yeah, actually, people may not know this, and Al may not know this, but we first met when you were in one of your first jobs, probably, James. You were working for Penguin.
A PR squint at Penguin.
And this is just maybe 20 years ago, just about 20 years ago. And I'd written a book called In Search of England,
That's right.
which was a series of essays about English identity. Yeah. I mean, strangely relevant now to us.
My goodness,
Indeed, I look back on it, and the last chapter was about a Caribbean West Indian family and their English identity, and the very last line of the book is sitting in the Barbudan Club in Leicester with a West Indian guy saying, "Well, we always said we were English," and that's about English identity. And I took it off the shelf the other day, thinking, "Wow!" But anyway, you and I travelled around England talking about that book. That was our first.
We had great conversations, didn't we? I remember talking about sort of Ibn Khaldun and ideas about that, and ideas about Charlemagne, and just talking history. It was just. God, it was fantastic. I love that little book tour we did.
Yeah, and H.V. Morton we talked about.
H.V. Morton and the Woodbolt Turner of Bucklebury Common.
With his, he set out after the First World War. He'd been in a hospital in the British Army in Palestine, I think, and in 1918, and he made himself this promise that if he survived, if he didn't die out there in what was then Palestine, he would, when he got back, do a journey around England to try and understand what England was. And of course he sets out I can't remember when it was now, 1927 or something like that. He sets out to do that journey and produce that book, In Search of England, which was the title I nicked for the book that we did.
But Mike, you've just okay, Al, you'll appreciate this, because Mike was invited to lunch by Field Marshal Montgomery at the House of Lords. Mike, you've got to tell this story. It's just, I can't even begin to tell you how many times I've recounted it on your behalf. But it's absolutely fantastic from start to finish.
Okay, you have to think yourself back to me as the Manchester school kid who was mad about the Norman Conquest, the Anglo-Saxons, as apparently we're not supposed to call them now, but pre-conquest England. And of course, I was one of those who thought that the Normans were, nasty, short haircuts and pointy little boots and fascistic destruction of our ancient culture and all this stuff, you see. So the Battle of Hastings was a tragedy to me. And then the anniversary year, and I'm at school, and the anniversary year comes up, and Field Marshal Montgomery, who of course is a great war hero of at that point, writes this big spread, like a lot of these experts at the time, the pundits who went over battlefields, Brian Horrocks and all these people. And Montgomery wrote this colour supplement for the Sunday Times, arguing essentially that the Norman Conquest had been a really good thing. And you can imagine that your younger listeners won't remember that clipped Montgomery voice, but damn good thing. But Normans brought European discipline and all that sort of stuff to the benighted, long-haired, boozy. There's a kind of Victorian myth that the Anglo-Saxons just kind of got pissed and sort of had created nothing. And that Normans brought European civilization. And I was so furious. I was in our Cuthbert Seaton's history class in Manchester, and I wrote this letter I kept screwing up pieces of paper thinking, how am I going to do this? And eventually I wrote the letter from King Harold, as if he was like in some Elysium, saying, it's absurd to think, your distinguished correspondent obviously have the faintest idea what really happened. This is what really happened. This is who we were. And the Sunday Times published this as a letter from King Harold, and I was covered in mud on the football field when the head boy came out and said, the High Master wants to see you. And I thought, well, come on, what's going on? And I went in, and the High Master, who was a bit of a cold fish, actually, held up with his thumb and his forefinger this letter going, what's this, Wood? And there was a letter from Montgomery saying, I gather that in another incarnation, King Harold Godwinson is a certain Michael Wood of Manchester Grammar School. I shouldn't imitate his voice, should I? But I hope people don't mind me doing that. And anyway, he then summoned me to debate this in the House of Lords with him, to have lunch and to talk about it. And I and you're kind of gobsmacked, aren't you? Because you think, well, and so I went down and had lunch in the House of Lords dining room. And the great moment in all this was when Clement Attlee came over and sat with us. Can you seriously imagine this?
Incredible.
And he said, so what are you doing here then? And I said, well, I wrote this thing about the Norman Conquest and, whether it was a good or a bad thing, and whether, had we really been cultured and civilized people before 1066? Hard to imagine people debated that then, isn't it? And Attlee leaned back and went, yes, the Norman yoke, that old chestnut. And of course, in Labour politics and socialist politics, going right back to the levellers and the diggers in the 17th century, the English radical tradition believed that before the Norman Conquest, we'd had a law-based society in which the king was answerable to the laws, and that we'd had certain freedoms that were lost by the Norman Conquest and afterwards, and that we never got back. And that the levellers and the diggers and the radicals in the 17th century believed that the king and his minister were naught but the conqueror's generals reincarnate, and all this. And this was a long strand in the English radical tradition. So I literally sat there with Clement Attlee saying, that old chestnut. And I remember telling this story to the great Peter Hennessy, who's one of our greatest modern historians, and he said, Christ, you got more words out of Clement Attlee than anybody else did.
But Mike, what did you make of the great Montgomery when you finally did see him? I mean, was he nice to you?
He was very nice to me, yeah, he was very sweet. He struck me as a rather lonely man. Do you remember he had the kind of caravan down at the bottom of his garden in Hampshire with and afterwards it was very interesting, yeah. He was very, very bitter about because you've got to think this is the 1966 and Europe was still divided. And Montgomery felt very, very bitter about the division of Europe, and he poured it all out to this schoolboy, that we should have gone straight on to Berlin, and so on. And the Americans had screwed him up, but he'd pushed for that. And he was very, very upset about all that. And it was still a real wound to him. And he kept saying, "Have you read my book on leadership?" And I'd go, "No," And about a week or two later, the postman came staggering up our little path in suburban Manchester with a box full of his books, all signed, saying, hope that this will kind of, I don't know whether he said improve your study of history or further it, but there was a curious sweetness about it. This old man and this young kid, but of course, I never changed my views on the Norman Conquest. I'm sure that Ladybird books play more. These early memories of history can be almost have the power of a myth, and you never lose that sense of that's what really happened.
That's what the debate is about at the moment, right now, about history is the casting myths that we've all taken on board and the collision of those myths. I mean, I had a book that I was given by my godmother when I must have been 3 or 4 by R.J. Unstead called Looking at History, which was pictures and stuff. So I've got my set image of Norman fields, with the rows and the inclines and how villages were this far apart from each other and how feudalism worked and where the salt was and all these set ideas and of course this sort of idea that Anglo-Saxons were cheerful hobbits who were then enslaved by ghastly, because that's such an interesting and compelling way of looking at it, isn't it? That of course people want to believe that. It's an irresistible notion.
It's Errol Flynn in Robin Hood, isn't it? It's injustice I hate, not Normans.
Not the Normans, and it's madness, isn't it? And of course, in 1966, great works had been written on Anglo-Saxon England already. Stenton's Anglo-Saxon England had been published in November 1943, right in the middle of, and it shows. It shows
1943. I didn't realise.
43. He did a new editions. But since then, of course, the whole subject of pre-conquest England, and it's 500 years we're talking about here. It's incredibly formative time, and of course we now know that the development of the English state from the early 10th century. That these were far-sighted rulers who had, were able to enact really far-reaching administrative reforms, swinging kind of powers. They restructured the land almost with this network of fortifications and towns and, a militarized society for 50 years probably till they loosened these things up in the 930s. So it's a completely different world of administrative expertise. They had the most advanced coinage system in Europe that they could recall every 5 or 6 years by the 970s and recoin, taking into account altering the silver content to take into account inflation, virtually. I mean, they...
But also, we also know that culturally they're so rich, aren't they?
They're so rich culturally. I mean, the Normans take over a much older and more sophisticated civilization. That's what nobody understood, even in 1966, and it was probably the richest country in Europe. It got great Latin culture, but remarkably a great vernacular culture. And when you look at our legacy, if you want to be, I don't want to sound jingoistic, but if you want to look at the legacy of the English in the world, the language, the literature, and the structures, the ideas about government and parliamentary systems, their roots are in the Old English period, and nobody could read what Anglo-Saxon poetry survives. Old English, let me call it Old English poetry survives without connecting it with the vernacular tradition that runs right through Chaucer to Shakespeare and whatever, the mood of it. Even this sense of humour. I was just writing something about great 7th century teacher, Hadrian of Canterbury, who, interestingly enough, Bede says was an African. Hadrian and Theodore had come to revitalise the culture in the 660s, and Hadrian had become abbot in Canterbury, and he was an African, fluent in Greek and Latin, and brings many African writers to Britain at that time. I've argued in the thing I'm bringing out that he's the most important Black Briton. But one of the things he brings in is the tradition of riddles. And there was a great North African writer called Symposius. And Hadrian brings this, and it really takes off among the English pupils in Canterbury. They love it. And everybody after starts trying riddles, and they do them in Latin and they do them in Old English. And you can't help when you read these riddles, and some of them are, about the natural world and about this and that, and some of them are really filthy, really filthy. You can't help but think of the Donald McGill postcards and the whole tradition of riddling in English culture, that it's earthy and it's naughty and it's I'm sorry I'll read that again, and I'm sorry I haven't got a clue. That it runs right through English culture. Shakespeare makes all these terrible jokes all the time. You remember the doctor in, is it Merry Wives? He's French, and so Shakespeare puns on his accents. Okay, you will make the first, he will make the second, I will make the third. And this is English humour that runs right through, and it's there. So you can't help but look back at the Anglo-Saxon period and see those kind of roots. Even though the last thing I would say about it when I try to reclaim England is that, of course, England in the 10th century was, there were Danish speakers, Norwegian speakers, Welsh, Cornish, different dialects of Anglian, different dialects of Saxon, Kentish. It was an incredibly multicultural society for its time. I'm not talking about colour, but I'm talking about probably 10 different major languages. So that polity that grew up, a great writer of the late 10th century says, the thing you have to understand about the kingdom of the English is that it's a land of many different cultures, languages and customs. And I think that's a very interesting model, isn't it?
But I think anyone who's been to Birmingham, Norwich, Plymouth, I mean, one of the things that's notable about this country is we do have, Newcastle, the different regional identities are very, very powerful, aren't
very they? Powerful.
And is that the legacy of that, or is it a continuation of that accommodation?
It's a continuation that runs right through our history. We're forever doing that. Not long ago, it comes back, funnily enough, to our In Search of England journey. J.B. Priestley, he wrote a wonderful book on England, and he was the great voice in the Second World War. Of course, his radio programs they
are absolutely fantastic. That's
very important.
Unbelievable. He was the voice of the people with that lovely Yorkshire accent, and he wrote this book about England, travelling around England during the Depression, and the sense of the different regional characteristics is so brilliant. I mean, my neck of the woods is Manchester, of course, and we Mancunians and South Lancashire people believe that, of course, most of the great comedians in modern British history come from South Lancashire. Everybody knows this, from Peter Kay to Arthur Askey to you name it. Les Dawson, it's obvious, to us Lancastrians. And I was reading J.B. Priestley for a little speech I was doing in Manchester just before the lockdown, and he arrives in Manchester and he goes to the Midland Hotel, and it's kind of gloomy and pouring rain and all that. And he said, why is it that the moment you arrive in Manchester, that every single person you meet seems to believe that they could be a music hall comedian?
Fantastic.
Yeah, fantastic. but when you, here we are doing a thing that you can do with history, which is our concerns right now are for our modern concerns, and this week in particular are swirling around questions of race and history. And one of the things that you do is whenever you write history, you're writing about now, in essence, aren't you? You're looking for the things you're interested now in back then, and that when we've had this debate this week, I mean, about history, and we mustn't the idea that pulling down a statue is somehow rewriting history, when maybe the statue was engaged in rewriting history itself. And anyway, anyone with a passing acquaintance with the history industry knows that what you've got to do when you put out a book, if you're writing a popular history book, it's got to have sensational new revelations or be a completely fresh take or will make you think again. That the rewriting, the rewriting is the engine of history, the inquiry and.
Well, I remember mentioning to Anthony Bevan, saying to him, well, every history of the Second World War is also a product of the age in which that history is being written, inevitably. Yeah. And I remember Anthony taking great exception to this, but I still think that's true. I mean, if you're writing a book about the Second World War in the 1960s, it's going to be different from what it is now, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
And that applies to all history, of course.
To all history. I mean, if I could put an analogy to you, I think the process by which nations develop their history. I'm not talking about totalitarian nations who rewrite history right off, But if you look at individual lives of people and the way we see our lives and the way you look back at how you were when you were 20, how you were when you were 40, and you, even as a person, you select different things from that past to fit with who you are now. You draw different things from the past, things that perhaps didn't seem important when you were 25. Now suddenly you think, actually, that really was important. So your view of yourself as a person changes over time, and you not exactly rewrite, but you rethink who you are, and you rethink the importance of events in your past, depending on where you've got to. And that's what nations do. And therefore, it's not that it just happens. You have to do it. It's impossible not to. And if you don't do it, and you look at the American Black Lives Matter, the truth is that the American Republic was founded on slavery, and that the Civil War was fought over slavery, but the Reconstruction really set in place, in the South especially, but everywhere really, an apartheid state that lasted until the 1960s, Jim Crow laws till 1965, horrendous things were done. The police services were organised in a way to contain black people. The mass incarceration was used as a means of containing black people.
I mean, there was a lynch in Florida, wasn't there, where 20,000 people turned up in 1934.
Yeah.
20,000 people came to watch.
I mean, these killings happened in the 1950s and into the 60s, So when I talk about rewriting history and reconsidering history and developing a new history, there's a classic case where, although there's a lot of great American writers, of course, have written about it, but the mainstream history has not moved with the times. And, of course, the great issue, which I know you guys have talked about a lot already on shows you've done, is how far have we in Britain moved with the times? How far have we understood where we are in history? How far have we looked back at who we were when we were a bit younger? 1920s, 1940s, we look back all the time. I mean, I know you guys love the 1940s, and don't get me wrong. I mean, my Uncle Bill was Dunkirk, D-Day, Berlin. My dad was at Haslar Naval Hospital in the operating theatres on D-Day. My mum was blitzed. All of them went through this. We grew up with it. But that story dominates and has played a really big role, I think, in the whole Brexit debate. And so how far have we moved on our history to think about who we are now? And that's what everybody's really talking about this week, aren't they?
Yeah. And how you face the things. I mean, to extend your analogy, how you face how you behaved that time that you've maybe decided to forget about. That argument you had with a friend, or all that stuff. and of course, after all, again, with you tend to remember the good times, don't you? And often suppress the bad times. I mean, it's a sort of has a psychological component as much as anything else, doesn't it? If you're on the couch, you talk about your childhood, don't you? And you have to face up to it and all that sort of thing. And it occupies if history is a sort of permanent national internal monologue, or a processing of an idea of a people's consciousness, then, like you say, if you leave things out, are you going to draw the right conclusions about now? We need to take a break, Michael, because we split these in two so our listeners can do whatever it is they do during the break. So we'll be back in a second, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Chalk. We're talking to Michael Wood. And what we've done in the first part was wrestle the subject of history, thorny subject of history, to the ground and defeat it. I think we can agree on that.
What we haven't done at all is talk about China.
Nobody
Which
defeats
is what we
history.
were going to do. Right, yes.
Nobody defeats history.
But you have done this monumental work on the story. I mean, you did the story of India a while back, and a few years ago you did the story of China, which was an amazing series for the BBC. And you've just finished writing your book, haven't you, Mike?
I have. China's been a very, very long interest of mine. In fact, the summer that I got involved with Montgomery, I was also buying Tang Dynasty poetry for the first time, and suddenly discovering a world that I never even dreamed existed. You know, we all make those discoveries in life, don't you? You know, you open a book and you go, what? And that's what happened to me then. And I shared with a sinologist in Oxford when I was a postgraduate, and I first travelled to China in the early 80s. And it's just the most incredibly interesting civilization and the most amazing history that I think of any country, really. It's so staggeringly creative, dramatic, humane in its ways, even despite all the violence and the tragedies and everything else. And I thought about writing a book, and then I realised I'm not a sinologist, and even though I'd had a lifetime's interest, it's too big a job. And I wrote 2 or 3 chapters of it back in 5 years ago. And then after the series went out, friends said, you should think about this, because there's no real a kind of book on China that accesses its history in an approachable way, And so the thing that I've been working on ever since, really, has been an attempt to look at it, not just the great narrative of the dynasties and the rulers, but these deep cores that go right down to the village level. I mean, not long ago, we did a series set in an English village, which has just been repeated on the BBC, The Story of England, about a place called Kibworth in Leicestershire, and where we took one village through the whole of British history, and with the help of the community and the people and all that. And I applied some of that to China as well, going down to village level, and of course all the latest discoveries. I mean, been amazing archaeological discoveries. You think of the Terracotta Army. I mean, that's quite a long time ago now. I mean, there's stuff which isn't even published yet, or preliminary publications in the last couple of years, staggering things coming out. So that's the book that I've written. And of course, and it goes right back into the past, but right up to the present as well. And of course, in studying recent history, I mean, from you guys, especially interested in the World Wars, it's really interesting to look at China from the point of view, our fourth ally in the Second World War.
Well, this is the thing, is it's never in the picture. What's going on in China is never ever in a conventionally told British view of the war. You may end up talking about the Eastern Front, about the Soviet Union's involvement. You may remember the Forgotten Army in Burma, but certainly what's happening in China isn't on anyone's radar at all. If people know about it, they know about Stilwell and the hump, but that's about. They get over the hump and then they forget they don't.
No, that's right.
They don't know what's happening beyond the hump.
Yeah, no, it's an amazing story, isn't it? Well, I mean, they were neutral in the First World War. but in the end agreed to help with personnel. And it's easy to forget until you look at the movie footage and the pictures that there were 40,000 Chinese helping the British on the Somme. And there's a big military cemetery near the mouth of the Somme with Confucian gravestones, and wonderful footage of the Chinese doing their dragon festivals and their dancing in the First World War. And of course,
they were responsible for a lot of the clear-up afterwards, weren't they?
Yeah. And they thought, by helping us like that, that they would... we would be on their side after the First World War. But the staggering thing was, the first great betrayal of China in the 20th century was that when the Treaty of Versailles took place, the German colonies in China weren't given back to China. They were given to Japan. And the fury in China, which led to the great movement of May 1919, was they couldn't believe that we could have done that, But nonetheless, they were the fourth ally in the Second World War. And as you say, Al, we all talk about D-Day, don't we? But you correct me if I'm wrong, but what was it, 1 million German troops in France and 6 million on the Russian front? Some kind of proportion like that. The Japanese war effort in China with the occupation of... that war was absolutely crucial to the winning of the war in the East.
Absolutely. But Mike, just to rewind a little bit, I mean, what's going on with China post 1919 and in the 1920s? Because the emperor it's the last emperor, isn't it? And the
last emperor was the empire ended in 1911 stroke January 12, and a republic.
Why is that? And how does that come about?
The empire had been staggering since the Opium Wars, to be honest. The British had defeated them in the first Opium War, the second Opium War, and then gradually it lost its... This happens to empires in history, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Rome, Persia, you name it. It gradually lost
Britain.
Britain. It gradually lost its sense of identity, its sense of purpose, and then cataclysmic series of risings and revolutions started to happen, and the biggest of which was called the Taiping Rebellion in the 1850s and 60s. That's been called the worst war of the 19th century.
Wow. More
people killed than the Napoleonic Wars or the American Civil War or the Franco-Prussian Wars and all that. 20 million dead, 16 years, horrendous destructions. And they survived, but battered. And then a lot of Chinese at that point, intellectuals and others, even though they're in intellectual life, have been gutted by the destruction of... You imagine kind of the Sorbonne and Oxford and Cambridge and all these places having been destroyed in the Napoleonic Wars and their libraries destroyed. That's what happened in the Yangtze Delta. But the intellectuals of the time said, we've got to modernise. And the big argument, do we modernise by drawing on the Chinese tradition? Do we imitate the West, adopt Western technology and all that? And the new movements at that time stressed that we really have to learn from the West. We have to industrialise. We have to adopt Western custom. And it went in the Republic after the fall of the empire right down to, the old culture is just a weight round our necks. It's cannibalized us. we should even shake hands and not kurto. We should wear suits, not Chinese clothes and all that. So the empire had gradually unraveled in the late 19th century. The modernization movement, which would have led to a constitutional monarchy probably and saved a lot of these catastrophes, was blocked by the Dowager Empress and her acolytes. And then the Boxer Rebellion happened. The Allied armies came in of 8 different countries, including the Americans and the Brits, the siege of Beijing, the defeat and a catastrophic indemnity imposed, the equivalent of 60 or 70 billion today. And from then on, the writing was on the wall, from 1901, and the movements for change grew and grew. All kinds of movements, socialist, Marxist movements, translation of the Communist Manifesto from English was done at that time, feminist movements, great feminist manifesto published in 1907. We don't know about any of this, do we?
No.
One of those brilliant works of feminism. And one of the great feminists was executed in the town square of her town in Shaoxing by the government as people fought for change. And the change gradually happened with the revolution in 1911. And Sun Yat-sen, who'd been in exile abroad, brought up in Hawaii, interestingly enough, English speaker, they instituted the Republic. But the Republic never commanded full allegiance, and warlords in different parts of the country fought over the authority of the Republic. In the 1920s, Communist Party founded in 1921, and the communists then start to form their own centres of power in the south, and then all-out war between the Republican government, the nationalists and the communists. And so but the catalyst for the massive change in the revolution was the Japanese invasion. 1936-37, Mao said...
So Mao has emerged by this stage, hasn't he?
Yeah. I mean, the
civil war sort of erupting, isn't it, between the nationalists?
Mao had seen firsthand in 1910 down in his native Changsha a rising against the government and the punishment of the rebels, the public execution and all that. And he told American journalist Edgar Snow about this in the 30s, and there's a very interesting narrative. And he'd been a librarian in Beijing, and he'd read widely, but he's a revolutionary nationalist, really. He's not they didn't know very much about Marxism or communism or the theory of it or anything. Nothing was translated into Chinese apart from the manifesto itself. But when the nationalists turn on them and murder thousands and thousands of communists, including Mao's wife and sister, and the communists break out in the 30s on the Long March up to the north. That's the moment when the split happens. But the Japanese invasion is the catalyst, because the nationalist government has to deploy its forces to fight the Japanese. So its main weight is against them. The communists are able to consolidate their power in Yan'an and then appear on the scene as a liberation movement with a lot of goodwill at that point for their land policies and all this sort of stuff, But once the Japanese are defeated, civil war happens between the nationalists and the communists roll them up, really, in enormous battles on the Huai River, and by 1948 to 9, it's over. Although,
so 45 to 48 is another 3 years of terrible
civil war, and so it's easy to You've got to realise the Second World War for China really starts in 1937, and it lasts pretty much until 1949. And there was an interesting thing recently talking about Clement Attlee, funnily enough, where a letter from Mao to Clement Attlee in 1937 was sold by the Attlee family, went for 605,000, I think, and this is a typewritten letter. In 1937, I think, November 37. So Japanese are devastating coastal China and are occupying coastal China and Shanghai and all that. The nationalists are fighting against them. The communists are up in Yan'an. And Mao writes a letter to Attlee, prompted by a New Zealand journalist who knew Attlee, who'd gone to see Mao, asking for the Labour Party's support and the support of all socialists and all fighters against fascism in this desperate situation in which the Chinese faced, And you look at that letter with kind of Mao's signature on it, but typed in English by the New Zealand journalist.
Amazing.
And you realise the world looked differently in 1937 from what it looked in the 1950s, and the catastrophic mistakes of the Communist Party from from the 50s onwards, you know. There's a great comment by one of Mao's people who knew Mao very well, talking about Mao, and he said if he died in 1956, he would be an immortal.
Yeah.
If he died in 1966, you might still have described him as a great man for all his flaws. But he died in 1976. Alas, what can one say?
Amazing. That's amazing. But how is China with its history now? You know, it's as it's sort of emerging as a kind of sort of, you know, really the most, even it's sort of starting to challenge America, and President Xi or what's his State Secretary Xi, we should call him, is sort of consolidating his power even more. I mean, what's China's relation with history today?
Well, of course, the relation with history is a really interesting question. And like all communist governments and all totalitarian governments, China, as soon as Communist Party was in charge in the 50s, they rewrote history to suit a Marxist interpretation of history. You know? And essentially, they still control history in that way, and they really object. For example, one or two American scholars like Peter Perdue have published books recently about the Chinese move west, you know. Xinjiang, for example. You've got the whole great debate at the moment, these awful things that are happening with the Uyghurs. There's a giant area of Western China which was occupied under the Tang dynasty back in the 7th century, and then under the Han briefly, but was conquered by the Qing dynasty in the 18th century, along with parts of Mongolia and Tibet, which was a protectorate of the Qing dynasty, which had always been an independent kingdom. And to give you an example of how they view history, they blocked American academics coming to do talks about their books about China going west and Xinjiang and all that, because all these places are viewed as an inviolable part of the motherland. So the interpretation of history is rigorously controlled. And President Xi, in fact, you'd say that if there are three big planks of the present government, growth must continue to secure the allegiance of this giant middle class on which their support rests. You know, so growth must continue. The monopoly of power by the Communist Party must continue and be reinforced, which it is being by AI, of course. And thirdly, the emphasis is on the Chinese way, which is not the Western way. It's not the way of Western liberal democracy, law-based societies with freedom of speech and so on. And President Xi justifies this by an interpretation of history, which is that this has always been the Chinese way, that you have 1.4 billion people now, you have more than 400 million in the Qing dynasty. It's not possible to rule this vast country with its vast population in the same way that liberal democracies control themselves. You know, Deng Xiaoping famously said to Jimmy Carter back in '79. You know, when he talked about when Carter made some comment about God, American politics, and Deng Xiaoping said to him, "You should try ruling China." and Deng Xiaoping said, "The thing is that the system of one vote, one man, and multi-parties would lead to total chaos in our country." Now, that's not necessarily true at all, but that's the way that Xi Jinping views it. So that their history then is seen as an indicator of the future path in politics. But it's also based on, Xi is a great reader of history. Apparently avidly read Peter Frankopan's Silk Roads book, for example.
Wow.
And Xi believes that we need to re-push the greatness of Chinese civilization. You know, Mao was all for getting rid of old ideas, old traditions, old ways. Xi is all for the greatness of Chinese history. I mean, we had a bizarre thing. We did that series, Story of China, as you know, on the BBC, and this was widely pirated in China. within 36 hours almost of every episode being transmitted, each episode was up with a full Chinese subtitling on websites. And we even got reviewed by the main, People's Daily and Xinhua, even though it wasn't seen on terrestrial. And of course, they rapidly cut the Tiananmen Square sequence out of it. And bizarrely, President Xi spoke at a conference about television in China, and he said, "Oh, now look, talking about documentary, these British guys have done this series called The Story of China, and they did a very good job. And you should look at this. You should look at this series and learn from it, because we need to tell the story of China better." And
right.
They're obsessed by how do we tell it to the world. They've got this thing about using foreigners. Of course, they've got things about especially they want to use the BBC. They want their stuff up on the BBC. We did a film last year about Deng Xiaoping's opening up, and our co-producers in China were going, "Can you get it on the BBC?" We just done a co-production on China's greatest poet, the Tang Dynasty poet, Du Fu, who lived in the age of Beowulf, and CCTV actually were co-producers on that, and of course drawn by the fact that the BBC were going to put it on the BBC as well. You see,
but Mike, I can see I can see if you're President Xi, I can completely see why your story of China would appeal to him, and why Peter's Silk Roads would appeal, because. Yeah, and I can also see absolutely the benefit if you want to come put yourself forward as the sort of preeminent nation in the world. Your heritage myth, your culture, your cultural background, that richness of history. We were doing stuff when you weren't even kind of, when you were still in kind of skins and loincloths. That's a good heritage to have, isn't it? And what you do so brilliant in your programs is you frame your history program in the present, so that what you're walking around places in China talking to people and saying, okay, this was this, what do you think about it? And so it gives it a sort of contemporaneous kind of feel to the whole thing.
Yeah, I always love that sense, and you can make films in a different way. I've really enjoyed watching David Olusegun's House Through Time, which is just completely documents based. Whereas and it works great. We've tried to do those filmic things which you couldn't do in a series like House Through Time in the same way, but the ordinary people and the living culture play their role in this. And what you're suggesting always implicitly is that there is a continuity between the living culture and the past, even where in somewhere like China it might seem to have been wiped out by the communists. Of course, it hasn't, and you scratch the surface, and there's an amazing scene in The Story of China at the beginning where we're 200 miles into the countryside south of the great industrial city of Zhengzhou, in farming country, with people who've never seen Westerners before. And 1 million people are at a festival for ancient gods and goddesses, farming people. And you'd have thought, when I first went in the early 80s, you'd have thought that was completely gone. And it just comes back.
Yeah. In a way, with the history of China, when do you even start? Because China's USP, isn't it, is that it is ancient, and and as you say, was a civilization that was doing. Jim said that was doing stuff when we were stood around in loincloths. Where do you even begin? Because part of the sort of certainly in manufacturing, I remember I went to the Bechstein factory once to look at pianos when I was doing a program about Germany, about German culture, and they'd been at some expo in China and realised that they could double the size of their factory making Bechsteins and still never meet demand in China for pianos from the middle class who want to buy a piano on the tick like they used to do in Germany in the 1820s. That you buy an upright, and that's how Bechstein got started. And he was saying that the big problem, of course, is that they have their unique way of making a soundboard, and all the Chinese piano companies were buying his pianos and literally pulling them to pieces to find out how to make them. And he was saying, well, what happened? That's what it used to be like in Germany in the 1820s, and there was no intellectual copyright. And then it developed to protect those industries. He said all the Chinese people he was dealing with were going, oh, you Europeans with your brand new copyright ideas. from the last couple of hundred years. What a load of baloney. That's not how we've ever done it in China for the last 4,000 years. So this idea of its ancientness is really, really a big part of their attitude to dealing with everything. And the West operates in this sort of temporary gadfly way, whereas China is sort of eternal, isn't it? Is the...
Yeah, I mean, you have to. I think you also have to give them credit for having invented most things before us. You know, so,
yes, well,
and we actually.
Of course.
I mean, we actually sent
absolutely.
We actually sent industrial spies to Jiang Dezhen to find out how they made the Ming porcelain in the 17th century. You know, silk. We smuggled out silkworms. We, high grade steel, the compass, the you name it, gunpowder. The stern rudder, the kind of, we kind of almost triumphed using Chinese inventions. So I think we're outraged now because of copyright things, and of course the Chinese don't acknowledge whole areas of Western law, which has been one of the big things that has been a problem in developing contract law with the Chinese. Initially in the 80s, opening up, a lot of companies found it impossible to deal with the Chinese because they weren't worth the paper they were written on. I mean, that's kind of changing now, but I think everybody's probably the same in this sort of stuff. They take everything. I mean, I did an interview at the big high-speed train workshops the year before last for this film that we did about 1978, 79, and the chief engineer, who was a woman, said, yes, initially it was contracts with the Germans and everything, but we very rapidly worked out what they did and we adapted it and we built our own. And our aim is to be totally made in China 2025. That's what they're after. Yeah. And we would do the same probably.
Well, no, of course. But I think it was the idea that the thing he was on the receiving end of, this guy, was the idea that China's old, Europe's temporary.
Yeah.
That we're going to come and go. The West will come and go, and China will remain, which I think is really, really interesting. So where do you even? When does China start?
I was hoping you wouldn't ask that question now. Well, I mean, the continuities are incredibly deep rooted because you've got a civilization that grows out of prehistory, which is continuous. Ever since, So you can look at the prehistoric clues, the development of cultures more than 4,000 years ago. I mean, it develops later as a civilization than Egypt and Mesopotamia, of course, But the development of the early dynasties from 2000 BC onwards, the continuities start to develop. And by the time you're looking at the first writing, which occurs about 1200 BC, the staggering thing is the moment when the archaeologists found those first oracle bones, there they were. They could see the same signs. Not all of them, but they could see the same signs used today. So the Chinese script, which is a really, really important aspect of the way the Chinese think, because it's a pictographic script, is still used today and separates them from, all the Western countries that use the Roman script I mean, what you're saying is that someone in China today could understand the writing of someone writing in China in 1200 BC? Well, you wouldn't be able to read the text of an oracle bone, but you would recognise the symbols for the sun or for rain or for whatever. Right. They're the same. The root of the language is the same. And many other things you would say still pertain in the culture, right. The ancestry. The importance of the ancestors and lineage is really, really important in those first documents from the Bronze Age. Certain patterns of behaviour, the primacy of writing, learning, the monopoly of writing and learning and stuff like that in the governing class, and then you look at the Confucian. Confucius lived about 500 BC, let's say, and in his texts, and those of his followers, you see a vision of life which is not based on theological belief or any kind of supernatural structure like that. It's essentially based on the collective over the individual, on social cohesion, on the necessity for people to be benevolent, to act with virtue. These are kind of codified and deeply written in the system. Now, as you well know, your brother Tom wrote a brilliant book recently called Dominion, which says that even though we're predominantly not religious societies anymore, although it's in the West, although they are in America, I suspect, we all still think like Christians. Well, the Chinese think like Chinese. And the idea of a mental universe structured by monotheism, and it's not necessarily even only the belief in one God, it's the belief in the whole structure of one truth, but they don't think like that at all. And I suspect that despite the 70 years of communism, those things, the predominance of the collective over the individual, the necessity to rub along, and the way we structure rubbing along in all sorts of important ways in the society, the attitude to ancestry, to children, to, there's many things in it that you read a 5th century BC text and you think the Chinese still, in an essential way, think like that, So, I'm not an expert in these things, as you know. I'm not a sinologist, but I've spent a lot of time in China especially the last 7 years, but going back many years. And you just notice, you sit there with your film crew, who you love our Chinese film crew. You sit there over dinner talking about things, and you think, yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? They're not bound by any of the religious taboos and social taboos that we are in the West, even though morality was at the center of their ancient civilization, you see. So it makes you think in a completely different way, really.
Oh, Mike, it's been fantastic. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much. That's absolutely fascinating.
A very wide-ranging and completely compelling hour of chat. Honestly, we could do it all day, every day. Yep. But thank you. That was brilliant.
So thanks for helping us kick off our Chalk series.
It's been a total pleasure, and we can't wait to all meet up next year.
Oh, I know. Bring it on. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Michael.
I'll get my welly boots ready.
The annoying thing is the weather next week looks absolutely amazing. Or rather, I should say, this week looks amazing.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mike, all the best.
Cheerio,
Thank
everyone.
you.
See you soon.
Well, thank you all for listening to our chat with the wonderful Michael Wood. And I just want to remind you that tonight there's being shown the Chalke Valley History Show on YouTube Premiere at 7:30 p.m. And you can see this by going on to the Chalke Valley History Festival website, www.cvhf.org.uk. That's cvhf.org.uk. And tonight we've got Sophie Roberts talking about the lost pianos of Siberia, contributions from Anita Anand, and lots of living history, A Day in the Trenches,